Welcome to Greene County Historical Society. I am Phil, and I will be hosting again tonight. Thanks for Matt, the director of the Greene County Historical Society, for letting us host a speaker tonight. I belong to the Montauk chapter number 3, an archaeology organization. We have Elena Frye over here who will be doing a nice little presentation for us tonight. We do this about every couple months or so, depending on holidays and weather. And would you like to do your presentation tonight?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the title of my presentation is Geophysical Investigations and Targeted Archaeological Testing at the Basilica of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, also known as the Hanover Chapel, which is located in Adams County, Pennsylvania. So just to start with like a quick little overview of the structure of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about me and who I am, my background. Then I'll give a quick overview of the project overall, the purpose of it, the location, the goals. I'll talk a little bit about the history of the Basilica, a little bit about the history of the site, as well as about the geophysical methods used, how those methods work, and how they're often used in archaeology. I'll talk about how we targeted survey grids for this project, chose locations to do our work, and then I'll go over the results of the initial geophysical survey, and then go over planned ground truthing and future research at the site. I had hoped to finish excavations before this presentation, which is why targeted excavations is the title, but unfortunately it got pushed back, so hopefully I'll be there later this week. So we're going to focus primarily on the geophysical methods, and I'll talk about where we're going to place those excavations. About me, like we said before, my name is Elena Frye. I am a master's student finishing my degree in applied archaeology at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Prior to coming to IUP, most of my experience was in the education and nonprofit space, and my undergraduate degree had emphasized cultural anthropology, but I kind of realized I wanted to pivot in 2022, applied to IUP. Since being here, I have worked on a variety of archaeological projects. Some of my favorites have been working as a research assistant on an Untold Stories project with an interdisciplinary team at IUP that was led by the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. I've done geophysical surveys, including mapping marked and unmarked graves in a cemetery in Indiana County. And this summer, I also helped run a program for undergraduates at IUP. We took students to a field site in Virginia, and we were working in a marsh doing field work in geology and archaeology, run by Dr. Christiani at IUP. I have chosen primarily to focus on archaeological geophysics throughout my degree. It's something that I love very much. I'm also interested in geographic information systems as well as remote sensing more broadly. And so this project, if you don't mind going to the next slide, is part of my master's thesis research. I focused on using geophysics to look for the original chapel school building at a site in Adams County. This map just shows the location of the site in Pennsylvania and then in Adams County in particular. If you, like me, have a very vague understanding of where the counties are, it's very close to Gettysburg. So my primary research interest, like I said, is in archaeological geophysics. This project has allowed me to lead a project centered around it, and it's also incorporated the use of GIS, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So overall, the project had 3 primary research questions. The first one, are there likely structural remains on the current or historical basilica property based on geophysical survey that includes ground penetrating radar and magnetic radiometer surveys? The second one being, are the interpreted structures from that survey actual architectural features? And the third being, are any of those likely architectural features able to be associated with the original parish school building through ground truthing? This presentation is primarily going to focus on the first research question. The other 2 depend on future excavations. So going into the church history a little bit, these photos, the one on the right is a drawing of the church, and the one on the left is a photo from the church's website of the church as it is today. So the Basilica of the Sacred Heart of Jesus is a minor Roman Catholic basilica in Hanover, Pennsylvania, near Gettysburg. It was originally founded in 1730 under the name Hanover Chapel. The original church included a log cabin as well as a log chapel building, but as the congregation grew, they needed a larger space. So by the 1780s, they had a congregation of over 1,000 members, and they tore down the original building and in its place on the same spot started construction on the present day building. The main section of the current church building was built between 1785 and 1787 with additions in the time since. It's the oldest stone Catholic church building in the United States, and it was one of the largest at the time of its founding. So from the original building, they've added on the transept, and the apse were added in 1851. In 1873, the present day steeple was added, so you can see on this drawing, it was not always there. And then in the 1880s, they remodeled the residence that's attached to the church. They added the mansard roof and expanded. It was named a basilica in 1962. And in the present day, the church is undergoing a restoration of the interior. So, like other contemporary Jesuit properties in the region around Pennsylvania and Maryland, the property at Caughnawaga was largely farmed for a lot of its history. The initial size of the property isn't entirely clear. Different sources say different things, but in the mid-18th century, it was somewhere between 120 and 190 acres. By 1776, that had grown to 750 acres, which seems to be the largest size. Most of the contemporary plantations relied on the labor of enslaved individuals. One thing that made Caughnawaga unique is that it primarily relied on the labor of free men and women and apprentices. However, I do want to note that there are 4 enslaved men documented in the church records. Their names were Johnny, Ben, Jack, and Peter. Johnny and Ben were listed in 1778, while Peter and Jack were documented in 1798 and were able to purchase their freedom by 1801. It's not known whether these 4 men performed agricultural or domestic labor, but no other enslaved individuals are found in church documents. So unlike other Jesuit plantations, the farming at Caughnawaga,
Oh, my bad.
the farming at Caughnawaga primarily relied, like I said, on free laborers. So in the mid-19th century, one of the families noted to be associated with the property was the Will family. They lived in a house that would have been down here a little bit. You can kind of see it. It was known as the Hermitage. One of the things I had hoped to do as part of my thesis was also searching for structural remains of that building, but most of the property that was historically associated with the church no longer is. So while this is a map showing a much larger portion of the property, today it's pretty much this area that's bounded. The man that lives here is a farmer who owns much of this property and some of the original church property, like right here. This was, I believe, some of the first land sold off to infuse some money back into the church. But in the mid-19th century, the Will family was in charge of most of the farming at Caughnawaga, except for a small section that was reserved for the Jesuits working at the church. The Will household in 1850 had Charles and Margaret Will, 7 children, and 7 additional adult laborers. In later years, the land was divided into 3 separate farms before eventually being largely sold off, giving us the much smaller section of the church property today. And just for reference about the map of the church property today, here is the basilica itself. Back here is the church's cemetery. This space is pretty much empty. I think the cemetery moves over a little bit into it, but historically it was just between these 2 paths. And this is actually the modern chapel school building. They had an independent chapel school, but in the past 20 years, with shifting Catholic school, like just as Catholic school populations have shrunk and church schools have combined, they are now part of the St. Teresa of Calcutta school. They joined with a couple other schools in the region in the past 10 years. So the map on the right is Caughnawaga in the 1800s, and the one on the other side was today. To get a little bit more into the history of the chapel school, Caughnawaga had a chapel school as early as 1834. Originally, it was operated by the Sisters of Charity from Emmitsburg, Maryland, but by 1851, the operation had been taken over by the Sisters of St. Joseph, who were more local. These photos both show corners of what's probably the original chapel school building on the church lawn. And this photo is also particularly useful because if you look at this versus some of the photos we'll see later, you can see how much the front lawn of the church has changed over time as well. Both of these photos show very incomplete references. They show enough that you can see that it's either brick, concrete, or stone, which is great for a geophysical survey because all of those things show up beautifully if they're below the ground surface. But by the early 1900s, the school was outgrowing that structure. It was replaced by a new school building in 1902, and this structure was demolished. So I'm going to talk a little bit about geophysical methods. This is the thing I'm most excited to talk about. This is the thing that I'm most excited about in general. I'm going to go into pretty great detail about the way that these tools work, and also to give credit where credit is due. My advisor, Dr. William Chadwick, is a geoarchaeologist with a background in archaeological geophysics, who is the one who has helped guide me not only through this project, but also it's his work and his course that brought me into this space and this specialty to begin with. And so these definitions are based on his lectures and his teachings and his practice. So to define geophysics, again borrowing his definition, geophysics is the earth science that's concerned with the physical processes and physical properties of the earth and its surrounding space environment, as well as the use of technology and quantitative methods for their analysis. For us in archaeology, archaeological geophysics is just the application of those tools to archaeological research questions. We do primarily near-surface geophysics, and I'll talk a little bit more at length about some tools, but just in general, the most well-known geophysical method for most of the public is probably ground-penetrating radar. Even if people don't know how it works, they've probably heard of it. If you've seen Jurassic Park, people talk about it, even though it's not really what they're doing. But magnetometry, a magnetic radiometer survey, electrical resistivity or conductivity surveys are also very common for archaeology. For this project, I used ground-penetrating radar, GPR, and magnetic radiometer surveys. So I'll talk a little bit more about them. And just to note, in general, in geophysics, we deal with what we call anomalies. So anything, we collect our data and we're looking for anything that isn't quite what we expected, something that's distinct from what's around it. And then we can investigate that further. First, I'm going to talk.
I went too far.
Oh no, that's okay. First, I want to talk about GPR. So a ground-penetrating radar system is made up of two antennae. You've got a transmitter and a receiver. It's going to send an electromagnetic pulse, a radio wave, into the ground, and then the receiver reads that pulse as it's reflected back up. A digital data logger on a computer will record the reflected signal, and it will also record the travel time and location. So different GPR systems can look different. Some of them look like this, like a little push cart. This is the one that we have, one of the ones that we have at IUP and the one that we use most often. It is quite literally a modified jogging stroller. The company that manufactures it, GSSI, had an agreement with a stroller manufacturer. So like, it even has the little footrest on it that says, "Don't stand on me." But as the data is collected, the speed of that pulse moving and the subsurface material are correlated to the interpretation of depth. So in other words, when you know what the ground is going to be made up of, and you know how fast that signal is moving, you can use those two things to calculate how deep those anomalies are. And when you're stitching the data together, you can produce a 3D model of the subsurface. Not all materials are suitable for GPR. One of the biggest challenges in collecting GPR data is attenuation, which is just a fun word for how much the signal is being lost as it travels through the ground. Higher attenuation means worse results. So materials that have the lowest attenuation are going to be dry sand, wet sand, air, non-salt water, both freshwater and brackish water are good, granite, dry salt, ice. All of these things are excellent, have very low attenuation rates. Pretty medium, you're going to have your silts, your shales, your clays, so it's very useful in environments like Pennsylvania. You're generally not going to find it being used in seawater. Salt water has very high attenuation, so it's not super useful. At this site in particular, most of the soils are silt loams and there's some silty clay loam. So it's a pretty well suited medium attenuation. And you tell the GPR what attenuation rate you're expecting. And so it's going to use that and the speed of the signal as it's read to calculate depth for you whenever you're processing data. GPR surveys are usually done in defined survey grids with defined transect spacing. So for this project, we did a 20 meter by 20 meter square as our initial survey grid. This is just one of the lines marking the edge of the initial grid. We want to have some overlap in the data we're collecting so that we can capture greater detail. And it's important to note that the signal actually moves conically. So it's not going straight down, it's going out in a triangular shape. And that means you don't have to be right next to each other to get some overlap. Depending on how deep you're targeting, you can have broader spacing, or depending on how much detail you need. Generally, the best practice that I was taught is to hit targeted anomalies at least 3 times so you can have as much detail as possible. We have, in this area, it's highly disturbed, and it's on the opposite side of the chapel from the church's historical cemetery, but both the priest and I were particularly concerned about the chance of identifying an unmarked grave, and keeping that in mind, we chose 25 centimeter spacing, because even if you're catching a grave on the short way, you're gonna hit it 3 to 4 times. That would just give us very clear detail for anything that is suspiciously shaped like a burial to avoid and mark for later. We collected data unidirectionally where possible, so always moving in the same direction, making data a little bit easier to process. But because of some obstructions in the field, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, we did do what are called reversals. So we went the opposite way, where we had to collect more data. These are all lovely obstructions in the field, beautiful landscaping, not so beautiful to run over with a GPR. So the picture on the left here is a little silly, but it shows part of the challenge of navigating a GPR system on different terrain. We use a GSSI SIR 4000 system with a 400 megahertz antenna. It's mounted on a utility cart with a distance encoder on one of the rear wheels. That lets the system calculate the distance it's moving. The company, like I said, manufactured these carts in agreement with the stroller manufacturer. So it's basically a modified stroller, which makes it very easy to push over smooth terrain, but if you've ever pushed a stroller over anything that's not smooth, you know it's pretty terrible. So that picture does not do justice how steep the edge of the church lawn is right there, which make it a little bit difficult to steer. And otherwise, the ground was well suited to a survey. I mean, I've spent an entire day clearing brush in a marsh to do a GPR survey, so this was much nicer than that. It could have been much worse. And then, like I said before, this photo on the right just shows one edge of the initial survey grid. To move in a straight line with the GPR, the practice that we use at IUP at least is using cones. We have a measuring tape on each of the sides that we're moving from and towards. This is for collecting data in one direction. And we use a cone to sight a nice straight line going down and move them down so that we know where we're going. One of my favorite useless skills is my now very well-honed ability to walk in a perfectly straight line. Not that anyone's testing it. The other method that I used for this project was a magnetic radiometer survey. So magnetometry measures the ambient magnetism of objects below the tool. And luckily for us, archaeological features often have magnetism that is distinct from the surrounding matrix. When we say magnetism, we usually think about magnetic objects, but that's only one piece of the puzzle here. You don't have to be magnetic, like a nail or a piece of other metal, to have magnetism. The magnetism of an object can be affected by many things. For example, bricks have magnetism as a result of their firing. Rocks have magnetism as a result of the direction or the alignment of Earth's magnetic field whenever they're first formed. And since we're looking for anomalies, whenever we're scanning the magnetic field of the area, things that are like rocks that have been moved or bricks that have been fired are going to show up as anomalies. So a magnetometer survey like this can be great for identifying structural remains in my site. We used a Geometrics G864 CCM magnetometer in gradiometer configuration. So what the photo is on the right, it looks kind of like a tool from the Ghostbusters, and it is much harder to carry than it looks. It's basically a very large backpack with the long pole mounted. It has a shoulder piece to keep the weight up, but you want to keep it perfectly straight as you're moving. In this case, with a gradiometer, you just have 2 stacked magnetometers. The one on the bottom is reading magnetism at the Earth's surface and below it, and the one on top is just reading that magnetism at the Earth's surface. So in post-processing, you can subtract those 2 readings and get a sense of just what's below the Earth's surface. We collected data on half-meter transects, so a little bit wider spacing here. And unlike the GPR, where we sight it with a cone and walk in a very straight line, this tool, it looks deceiving, but it is much harder to steer than the stroller is. So we actually place a non-magnetic tape down to guide the tool on each transect. You can go to the next one. So those are the tools that we use, and a little bit about how they work and how you collect data with them. I want to talk about how we selected the location for the initial survey grid. So this is the church property in 1901. You can see here, we have a picture of the chapel, the cemetery in the back. This is marked as a vineyard and an orchard. This barn is still standing across the street. And this is what we used as a base to try to figure out where that school building might be. There's a little square right here marked SCH. And based on that and the photos, that's why we can assume that building is probably the school, but we're going to investigate it further. This was the starting point for figuring out where to place the grid. The original school was demolished, but also since then, they've built the new school, they've expanded the parking lot and built out a new parking lot in front of the residence and the new school building. The road out front was also expanded. And so I took this map and I brought it into ArcGIS Pro. On the left is just a cut version of that map showing you just the chapel building and the front lawn. And on the right is what that looked like brought into ArcGIS Pro. Like I said, the landscape and the roads have changed a lot. So to georeference this and kind of stretch it to fit the modern landscape, I relied a lot on the church building itself, knowing that that hasn't moved. It's grown, but not the base of it. And also some of the intersections to the rear of the property, kind of on like the northeast side, have stayed very similar. By georeferencing that map, we were able to get a sense of where that building might be. And you can kind of see through here, it's right on the corner of the church lawn, straddling into, this road is called Basilica Drive, and into the parking lot for the school. The other benefit of this is that it gives us a sense of the size of the school, because we don't have any complete photos of it. By doing this, you're able to measure it, and it's basically a 30 foot by 30 foot square, which gives us a sense of what size of anomaly we're looking for if there are structural remains associated with the building. So, having done that, this red square on this map is an estimated footprint of the school based on that map. And I placed an initial survey grid in ArcGIS Pro just to get an idea of if we could place a 20 by 20 meter grid with avoiding some of the obstructions. So right here, we have the row of parking. There's parking beams on all of those. This is a brick-lined garden bed that has a bunch of bushes. We've got a tree right here with a metal stake that can't be pulled out. And over here is the very steep edge of the church lawn that goes right up against a retaining wall. So placing the grid, we ended up moving it around a little bit. This was just to get an idea to see if that size of grid would be possible while limiting some of those obstructions. And also just to note, in addition to all of our geophysical methods in the field, we took GPS points of the corners of the grid as placed in reality, and also all of the obstructions that we had. That way, if we had any data that was missing in our final process data, or anything that looked really weird, like a really magnetic spot in the middle of the field, you might be able to put those GPS points over it and see, oh yeah, there's a giant metal stake that's concreted into the ground here. That will also let us bring the data into ArcGIS Pro later to collect GPS points for any anomalies that we identify in the data so that we can go out and ground truth them. And then just to recap a little bit, the geophysical equipment that we used. This is our GPR, the GSSI SIR 4000 with the 400 megahertz antenna on a utility cart with a distance encoder. That is our Geometrics magnetometer. And we also use a Trimble GeoXH as our GPS in the field. The use of multiple survey methods in a geophysical survey lets you strengthen the identification of an anomaly, and it can also aid in the interpretation of the survey results. And again, to give credit where credit is due, all of the equipment used for this survey is owned by and was loaned out by the Indiana University of Pennsylvania from the Department of Anthropology, Geology, and Earth Sciences. One of the challenges to beginning a geophysics program as both an educational institution or the private sector is the upfront cost. So owning and maintaining all of this equipment for student use is an amazing thing that IUP is able to do, and I would not have been able to do this project without the support of the program at IUP, or in particular, without the support of Dr. Chadwick, who makes sure all of this equipment is maintained for us, troubleshoots all of the problems that we have, and teaches us all how to use it. One of the most amazing things about being at IUP is that not only are we learning how to collect all of the data, we learn how to process it ourselves. We learn how to collect it, how to target our grids, collect the data, process it, interpret it, and test it from start to finish. And he makes sure that every student who is interested in doing that is able to get all of that experience. So let's talk about some of the results. So when you look at GPR results, you can look at individual transects that you've collected data on, and you can also look at that 3D model that the software stitches together for you. This is a view top down of the 3D model. This is a slice at about 1/2 meter of depth below the surface. And like I mentioned before, there are some obstructions in the grid. So whenever the software runs into areas with no data, it tries to fill it in. And that's where you have this blurring. So right at the edge of the survey grid, there was a tree. And so from here to here, which is where the bushes are, we're missing data. We're able to get data on the back end. This area, it's also very blurry, all the way through here, is because of the bushes in that brick-lined garden bed, as well as the parking beams that were blocking it off. Like I said, when the software can't read data, it doesn't just leave it blank, because no data is still data. It's filling that in for you. Fortunately, that did not stop us from identifying a very large anomaly in the survey grid. So if you're not used to looking at GPR data, just squint at it until it becomes something. One of my most distinctive memories of being at IUP is looking at GPR data for the first time and just staring at the same page for 10 minutes and watching everything sort of come to life. And so right in here, you can see this white line coming all the way here, and there's a very solid right angle right here, and it goes into this straight line right up here all the way to the edge. In a moment I'll show you this grid next to where it is in real space, so you can have a better sense of what it looks like on the ground. But this white curve right here is the expanded road on Basilica Drive. And so what we have here is an anomaly that's about 10 meters or about 30 feet on its longest edge, right where we expected the structural remains of the travel school to be if they were still there. You can go to the next slide. There we go. So this, like I said, this is that road expansion, which is going to be that light asphalt right here. And that places the anomaly associated, hopefully, with the chapel school. The likely structural remains to be right here on the edge. In this case, just to like orient, south is up. And yeah, that is the anomaly that we identified in the GPR data. There are some other things where you can see, like I said, this anomaly isn't something we need to investigate. It's right lined up with the road surface. So we wouldn't be able to dig it anyway, but this is what we're gonna target with our excavations. And then this is what the data looks like whenever you're looking at a single transect. This is on line 17, and it shows that same anomaly, and this lets you see the depth of the anomaly, where it begins, where it ends, and also how wide it is. So in this case, you can see this is the reading of depth, and it estimates it beginning at just above 1/2 meter below the surface, and it continues down for about 1.5 meters, which in Pennsylvania, the standardized frost line is about 42 inches. So that is the perfect depth to be the foundation of a structure that was meant to be lasting for decades, which this building would have been at least about 50 years old whenever it was demolished. And now we can talk a little bit about that magnetic radiometer data. So whenever you process magnetometer data, you get to choose a color scheme. You are looking at areas of high and low magnetism. Something else that's important to note is that archaeological features tend to have very little, it's distinct from the surrounding magnetism, but it's not very far. It's usually within 5 to 10 nanoteslas of the surrounding matrix. I chose a blue and yellow scheme for this. The blue areas are areas with relatively high magnetism, and the yellow areas are areas of relatively low magnetism. This data was filtered to show differences that were within plus or minus 10 nanoteslas to help focus on those objects that have less differentiation. And right here, we've highlighted an anomaly in the same spot. If you want to go to the next slide, this also should have a map showing you, again, it's right here. And so you can see here the same anomaly associated with the edge of the road surface. This is still that lack of data. This one is also caused by the presence of the tree. But in here, you can see an anomaly of the same size and same shape as the anomaly identified in the GPR data, which just sort of reinforces the presence of something there to investigate further. And then the next slide just has those two anomalies side by side, the same anomalies identified, beginning right about here and right about here, right next to the area with no data, right next to the area with no data, up, almost intersecting with the anomaly associated with the expanded roadway. And like I said, this was just focusing on the first research question for my thesis. And the next week, we'll be processing data that we collected on an adjacent grid. This data isn't data that we'll be able to ground truth because it's all going to be on the concrete associated with the road, but it will give us a sense of whether or not there are any continued, or if there are any structural remains buried under that expanded roadway, which given the depth of the anomaly in the grass is very possible. We're also going to be doing targeted archaeological testing to test the anomaly. So if you can go back a couple slides actually. Right there is perfect. Whenever we're testing anomalies, because we're looking at something that's different, we usually want to test a spot where we get partially the anomaly, partially surrounding matrix. So we'll be placing 3 to 4 excavation units on the edge of this anomaly and then possibly investigating into it once we identify the edge of it, confirming whether or not it's architectural remains, and then hopefully excavating within it to see if we can find any artifacts that confirm the nature of the structure. Again, probably the school, but if we can find evidence for that in the archaeological record, it'll strengthen that conclusion. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you.